Hello, everyone. We are Group 7, and we'll be speaking on the topic of Let it be resolved that mandatory minimum sentencing laws shall no longer exist in Canada.
Mandatory minimum sentencing laws require judges to impose at least a fixed minimum punishment for certain offenses. This means that even when the circumstances of a case are unique, and even when a judge believes a lower sentence would be more appropriate, the judge is not allowed to go below that legal minimum. In Canada, these laws are often defended as a way to appear tough on crime, create consistencies in sentencing, and improve public safety. However, they have also been widely criticized for being rigid, unfair, and ineffective. The, this issue is not just about punishment, it is about what kind of justice system Canada wants to have. From the perspective of Foucault, power, and institutions, punishment is not simply a neutral legal response. It is also a part of a broader system of regulation, discipline, and control, where rules can be used to standardize people and limit individualized judgment. In that sense, mandatory minimums reflect a model of justice that values fixed control over flexibility and proportionality. Our position is that mandatory minimum sentencing laws should no longer exist in Canada. In this introduction, we will briefly lay out three main arguments. Our first argument is that abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing laws creates an opportunity for progressive reform. Removing these laws is not about being soft on crime. It is about moving away from a rigid, punitive model and creating space for a justice system that is more flexible, fair, and responsive to people's actual circumstances. A more progressive politics should not only focus on criticizing harmful systems, but also on building better ways to governing and responding to social problems. In this case, abolishing mandatory minimums opens the possibility for a more thoughtful and proportionate approach to justice rather than one based on automatic punishment. This point also matters because political and legal systems do not have to remain tied to one model forever. Approaches that have become normalized can still be challenged and reshaped. Just because punitive sentencing laws have become politically familiar does not mean they are the best or most just response. Abolishing mandatory minimums gives Canada the opportunity to rethink punishment in a more progressive direction, one that emphasizes fairness and better forms of governance rather than rigidity alone. Our second argument is that laws requiring minimum sentences are expensive and ineffective because they do not increase public safety. Although these laws are often justified as a deterrent, research does not support the claim that harsher punishments reduce crime more effectively than proportionate sentencing. In fact, mandatory minimums have been criticized for increasing prison costs while failing to make communities safer. The evidence also shows that longer and harsher incarceration can create additional social harm rather than solve the underlying problem. It can worsen isolation, reduce employment opportunities, and make reintegration more difficult, all without clearly improving deterrence. As a result, these laws can consume more public resources while offering little in return in terms of safety or effectiveness. Our third and last argument is that mandatory minimum sentences undermine judicial discretion and can lead to unfair decisions. By forcing judges to impose fixed minimum punishments, these laws limit the ability of the court to consider the full circumstances of a case, including the background of the accused, the seriousness of the offense, and the principles of proportionality in sentencing. As a result, mandatory minimums can produce outcomes that are not always just or appropriate for the individual case. So to be clear, our position is that mandatory minimum sentencing laws should no longer exist in Canada because they keep the justice system tied to a rigid and outdated model. First, abolishing them creates an opportunity for progressive reform and a better way of thinking about justice. Second, they are costly and ineffective, and the research does not show that they actually improve public safety. Lastly, they undermine judicial discretion and can result in unfair sentencing outcomes. For these reasons, our group's position is that Canada should move away from mandatory minimum sentencing and towards a model that allows for a more thoughtful and individualized decision making. A more just system is not one that punishes as rigidly as possible, but one that responds proportionally, uses discretion wisely, and remains open to reform when existing policies no longer serve the public good.
The history of mandatory minimum sentencing in Canada. The development of mandatory minimum sentencing in Canada has not followed a straight or predictable path. Instead, it has expanded, been repealed, and then expanded again at different points in Canadian history. This uneven development demonstrates that sentencing laws are closely connected to political priorities and broader transformation in how state power is exercised. When governments prioritize public order or respond to public concern about crime, mandatory minimum penalties tend to increase, whereas concerns about fairness and judicial discretion have led to reform. These shifts suggest that mandatory minimum sentencing are not neutral legal mechanisms, but rather reflect changing understandings of crime, risk, and social order. To better understand these transformations, Michel Foucault theories of power provides a useful analytical framework, particularly his argument that modern punishment shifts from visible displays of authority to more subtle forms of control that regulate behavior through legal and institutional systems. This perspective allows us to move beyond simply drawing laws and instead understand how punishment functions as a way for the state to manage and control behavior within society. In 1892, Canada introduced its first criminal code, where only 6 offenses carried mandatory minimum sentences, including prize fighting, fraud upon the government, and robbery related theft. As Crutcher explains, these early penalties were limited in scope and were not a central feature of sentencing policy. The socio historical context is important, as Canada at this time was consolidating its legal and political institutions, and the state sought stability and authority. Foucault's concept of sovereign power helps explain this period, as punishment functioned to reinforce the authority of the state. In this context, mandatory minimum sentencing can be understood as tools used to assert control and demonstrate authority, rather than mechanisms designed to regulate populations through standardized systems. Foucault describes sovereign power as a form of power rooted in authority, where punishment serves as a visible demonstration of control. Under this model, fixed sentencing reinforces the dominance of the state, and judicial discretion is limited because maintaining order is the primary concern. The early use of mandatory minimum sentencing reflects this structure, as fixed consequences signaled that certain offenses would not be tolerated. This reflects a form of punishment centered on authority and visibility rather than the later development of systems that regulate behavior through normalization and standardization. In the early 20th century, mandatory minimum penalties expanded to include firearm use, drug offenses, and impaired driving. This expansion occurred during a period of rapid urbanization and industrialization, which generated concerns about public safety and social disorder. Foucault's idea of a transition from sovereign power to disciplinary power becomes relevant here. Disciplinary power is less focused on visible displays of authority and more focused on regulating behavior through institutions and standardized rules. Mandatory minimums sentencing increasingly functioned as a regulatory mechanisms shaping behavior across society rather than simply reinforcing authority. In other words, sentencing becomes less about reacting to a single offense and more about creating systems that guide and control behavior in advance, which reflects the growing importance of discipline in modern legal systems. Foucault argues that modern punishment operates through discipline, which functions by organizing behavior through institutions, rules, and normalization. Mandatory minimum sentences reflect this disciplinary logic because they reduce judicial discretion and impose standardized penalties across cases. Instead of individualized assessment, the system produces uniform outcomes, contributing to the normalization of punishment. In this way, mandatory minimum sentencing can be understood as a disciplinary mechanism that standardizes punishment and expands the state's ability to regulate individuals through consistent legal processes. This reflects a broader shift towards bureaucratic governance, where control is exercised through systems rather than through direct displays of authority. Between the 1950s and 1960s, several mandatory minimum penalties were repealed, including theft related offenses and certain firearm minimums. This period followed World War II, when Canadian criminal justice policy increasingly emphasized rehabilitation and individualized sentencing. Judicial discretion regained importance, particularly with major reforms in 1969. From a Foucauldian perspective, this does not represent a disappearance of power, but rather a transformation in how power operates. Instead of relying heavily on rigid disciplinary mechanisms, the system allowed greater flexibility while still functioning within institutional structures that continue to regulate behavior. This demonstrates that punishment strategies evolve alongside broader political and social values while still reflecting underlying systems of control. Foucault emphasizes that power operates through discourse, meaning the ways in which issues are discussed and defined. The language used to describe crime influences policy decisions. When certain offenses are framed as serious threats, stronger penalties become politically acceptable. As Sam 2019 explains, dominant discourses privilege particular understandings of crime while marginalizing others. Mandatory minimum sentencing, therefore, reflects not only crime itself, but also the way crime is constructed as dangerous or urgent within society. This demonstrates how power operates through knowledge, shaping both public perception and legal responses. Beginning in the 1970s, Parliament increasingly introduced new mandatory minimum penalties, particularly for drug and firearm offenses. This period was marked by growing public concern about crime and increasing emphasis on law and order in political discourse. Foucault's concept of population management becomes central here. The focus shifts from punishing the individual offenders to managing broader social risks. This means that the concern is no longer only about what someone has done, but also about what they are perceived as capable of doing. Mandatory minimum sentencing becomes a tool used to regulate groups considered risky, reflecting a shift toward governing populations rather than simply responding to individual behavior. Foucault's concept of governmentality explains how modern states govern populations through risk calculation and regulation. Rather than relying on visible punishment, power operates through policies that structure behavior in systematic ways. Mandatory minimum sentencing reflects this form of governance by standardizing punishment, limiting judicial discretion, and defining certain offenses as inherently risky. In this sense, punishment becomes less about individual more judgment and more about managing potential threats within society. This demonstrates how sentencing policy functions as a technique of governance used to regulate populations on a broader scale. In 1995, the Firearms Act introduced multiple 4-year mandatory minimum sentences for firearm offenses. This legislation emerged within a political climate focused heavily on public safety and gun control. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, support for mandatory minimum penalties continued, often associated with tough on crime approaches. Over time, mandatory minimum sentencing evolved from a limited 19th century tool into a central element of Canada's criminal justice system. Through Foucault's framework, this development reflects a broader transformation in how power operates from sovereign authority to disciplinary regulation to modern systems of risk management. This history is important because it shows that mandatory minimum sentencing is not simply a neutral legal response to crime, but a disciplinary mechanism that expands the state's capacity to regulate behavior and manage populations, raising important questions about whether such policies should continue to exist.
Now I'm going to move into the second part of the history, focusing on about 2005 to the present. Between 2005 and 2012, Parliament significantly expanded the use of mandatory minimum penalties, often referred to as MMPs. During this period, several new minimum sentences were introduced or strengthened, particularly for firearms offenses, child pornography offenses, and sexual offenses against children. Statistics Canada research shows that these reforms had clear effects on sentencing outcomes. When researchers compared cases before and after the introduction of MMPs, they found that the proportion of custodial sentences increased significantly. For example, after mandatory minimums were introduced for child pornography offenses in 2005, many cases that previously resulted in probation or conditional sentences began resulting in jail sentences instead. However, the Jurastat report also shows an important limitation. Court data does not capture prosecutorial decision-making, such as plea bargaining. This means researchers cannot fully see how MMPs influence negotiations between prosecutors and defendants. Using Bever's interpretation of Foucault, this shift can be understood as the expansion of disciplinary power through institutional rules. Disciplinary power works by organizing behavior through rules, categories, and standardization, rather than relying on individual judgment. MMPs reflect this because they group offenses into fixed categories and attach set punishments to them. This means judges have less ability to consider the specific details of each case and must follow the same rules for everyone. The increase in jail sentences after these laws were introduced can be explained by this shift. Instead of judges deciding punishment case by case, sentencing is guided by strict legal rules. In this way, mandatory minimum penalties increase state control by building it into the legal system itself, making punishment more consistent but also less flexible. Even with the data limitation, scholars argue that MMPs influence the entire justice process. These laws can reduce both judicial and prosecutorial flexibility and can significantly affect plea bargaining. For example, if someone knows that they will automatically receive a jail sentence if convicted at trial, they may feel pressure to accept a plea deal instead. This can create what researchers call a trial penalty, where defendants plead guilty in order to avoid harsher mandatory sentences. This is where Foucault's concept of governmentality, as explained by Bever, becomes useful. Governmentality refers to how modern states manage populations through institutional rules, administrative practices, and systems of knowledge. MMPs reshape decision-making across the justice system. They influence how prosecutors charge cases, how defendants evaluate risk, and how judges approach sentencing. Rather than directly forcing behavior, these laws structure the conditions under which these decisions are made. In this way, state power extends beyond the courtroom itself. It operates through the system as a whole by shaping how individuals act within it. Another factor explaining the expansion of MMPs is political appeal. Dube and Cesaroni argue that mandatory minimum sentences are politically attractive even when research does not clearly show that they deter crime. These policies send a strong message that the government is being tough on crime and prioritizing public safety, even when there is no evidence that it does. At the same time, research shows that public opinion about MMP can shift when people are given more information about specific cases. Roberts found that when individuals are presented with the details of real cases, they often become less supportive of rigid mandatory sentencing policies. The expansion of MMPs eventually led to constitutional challenges. In 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada addressed this issue in R v Noor. In R v Noor, the accused was found in possession of a loaded, prohibited handgun in a public place, which is a serious offense. However, the law imposed a mandatory minimum sentence that applied to a wide range of situations, including less serious cases, such as people who may have improperly stored a firearm or made a licensing mistake without any intent to use the firearm dangerously. The Supreme Court acknowledged that while Noor's conduct was serious, the problem was that the law did not allow judges to distinguish between more and less blameworthy situations. This made the law unfair because it would require the same harsh punishment, even in cases where it would clearly be excessive. Supporters of the MMPs argued that these penalties were necessary to deter crime and protect public safety, but the Supreme Court reached a different conclusion. The court ruled that mandatory minimum sentences can violate Section 12 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms if they impose cruel and unusual punishment. And so they introduced the concept of reasonably foreseeable hypotheticals, allowing judges to consider situations where the law could produce a grossly disproportionate sentence, which means that the punishment does not fit the crime. The following year, the Supreme Court reinforced this reasoning in R v Lloyd in 2016. In this case, the accused was convicted of possession of drugs for the purpose of trafficking and had prior drug-related convictions, which triggered a mandatory minimum sentence. However, Lloyd was also a drug user, and the court recognized that the law applied broadly to people in very different situations, including individuals involved in low-level drug activity or struggling with addiction rather than large-scale trafficking. The issue was that the law did not allow judges to consider these differences, which meant it could impose a severe sentence that did not match the individual's level of responsibility. The court explained that MMPs that applied to offenses committed in many different ways by a wide range of individuals are vulnerable to constitutional challenge. So the court suggested that Parliament could respond by either narrowing the scope of mandatory minimum laws or introducing a judicial safety valve, allowing judges to avoid applying the minimum sentence in exceptional cases. Today, MMPs continue to influence sentencing outcomes in Canada, even after the Supreme Court's decisions in Noor and Lloyd. Recent research by Penny, Lehrer, and Gallin shows that MMPs affect more than just the minimum sentence itself. Their study found that when mandatory minimums are introduced, sentences across the entire sentencing distribution increases. They described this effect as an inflationary floor, meaning that once a mandatory minimum is introduced, it pushes all sentences upward, not just the lowest ones. The decisions in cases Noor and Lloyd are important not just because they struck down specific laws, but because they highlight a broader issue with MMPs. Both cases show that when sentencing laws are too rigid, they can produce unfair and disproportionate outcomes that fail to reflect individual circumstances. This is key to the debate over whether MMPs should be abolished. If these laws consistently limit judicial discretion and risk violating constitutional rights, it raises the question of whether they are an effective or appropriate way to govern punishment. In this sense, the Supreme Court's rulings suggest that a system based on strict, standardized penalties may conflict with the principles of fairness and proportionality that are meant to guide the criminal justice system. Overall, MMPs do more than simply set minimum sentences. They reshape sentencing practices across the entire justice system. So should punishment rely on standardized rules and deterrence, or should judges have flexibility to consider individual circumstances?
Argument number 1. Abolishing minimum sentencing as an opportunity for progressive reform. Our first central argument is that abolishing minimum sentencing can serve as an avenue for progressive change through introducing rehabilitatory measures as a possible alternative to incarceration. In Ferguson's text, he acknowledges neoliberalism's negative effects on the working class. However, he emphasizes that the left should go beyond simply opposing oppressive systems and should push for concrete progressive changes. He uses Foucault's argument that socialist political movements failed to develop new ways of organizing and managing society to further his point. Socialism does have its own distinct form of governance, with collective ownership of the means of production and production organized around social need as opposed to production for profit in capitalism. Even though socialism offered a new form of social organization through an alternative mode of production, Foucault argued that its movements did not change the disciplinary and centralized ways of governing people. In the context of neoliberalism, Ferguson argues that governing techniques within the neoliberal framework have the potential to be repurposed by the left to create progressive change. Now, let's step back into discussing mandatory minimum sentencing. Through Ferguson's lens, abolishing minimum sentencing and introducing rehabilitatory measures would provide a progressive alternative within the existing framework of the criminal justice system. Why would this be a progressive change, you may ask? Well, because mandatory minimum sentencing is a rigid way for the state to govern crime through removing flexibility and treating people only as offenders rather than individuals with different circumstances. Broader societal implications of criminal justice changes. Building on Foucault's argument that socialism lacked in creating its distinct form of governance, abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing could be a step forward in creating a new, more progressive way of governing people. Instead of relying solely on strict punishment, the justice system and government would need to address the social causes and structural conditions of crime. The criminal justice system would need to focus more on rehabilitation, and the government would need to invest in prevention through social support. This would represent a shift away from controlling people solely through coercive discipline toward governance focused on social welfare. Governance through social welfare would govern with more support over control. It would focus on prevention through social programs and rehabilitation for individuals who need it. Rehabilitation as a tool to repair social glue. As we previously learned in this course, Durkheim believed that a shared sense of morality acts as social glue, and that conformity is positive as it creates stability in society. From this perspective, providing rehabilitative measures, when applicable, would allow offenders to have another chance at being part of society. Durkheim emphasizes that punishment is important, as it reinforces what society has deemed unacceptable and deters people from those actions. Rehabilitation can still fulfill this function of punishment by reinforcing society's moral boundaries through working to realign offenders with them. Rather than further isolating offenders from society through incarceration, rehabilitation would help offenders to make changes that adhere to the social norms with the aim of reintegrating them into society. Ineffective forms of rehabilitation. Abolishing minimum sentencing opens the door for alternative approaches to justice, particularly rehabilitation, but not all rehabilitative models are equally effective. Many existing rehabilitation strategies reproduce the assumptions that shape the current model of punishment, so they're not alternatives to the existing system. Authors Marash and Anderson discuss how liberal ideology has shaped rehabilitation, primarily in the U.S. criminal justice system. They criticize approaches that attempt to reform offenders through work and ignore larger societal structures. Marash and Anderson refer to the framework of reform through work,
which assumes that offenders commit crimes because they're poorly integrated into the job market. Some of these reforms include prison labor, teaching jobs while incarcerated, prisoners working outside of prison before release, job placement programs after release, and employment as a condition of parole. However, studies found that the link between crime and unemployment is weaker than assumed, and employment programs did not reduce reoffending. Why is this information useful? Understanding rehabilitation in prison through work isn't ineffective further supports that abolishing minimum sentencing in certain instances can open the door for more progressive alternatives that address the offender and their societal conditions effectively. So, what would be a good example of an effective rehabilitation strategy? Psychiatric rehabilitation as an alternative. Abolishing minimum sentencing creates an opportunity for governance through support over coercion, with rehabilitative programs that focus on addressing the root causes of offending rather than relying only on incarceration. Lamberti explains that correctional programs based mainly on surveillance and punishment are ineffective at preventing reoffending. An effective prevention of reoffending, however, is combining treatment with supervision rather than relying only on punishment. The article identifies risk factors that lead to crime, including antisocial thinking, family instability, and criminal peer groups. Lamberti suggests that an approach that involves collaboration between mental health professionals and criminal justice authorities. This approach can be especially helpful for some of violent crimes that minimum sentencing currently encompasses. Rehabilitation in the form of behavioral treatments, particularly cognitive behavioral approaches, is among the most effective methods for reducing reoffending. These programs offer professional help for offenders to change patterns of thinking and behavior that contribute to violent tendencies. Lamberti advocates for healthcare professionals and criminal justice workers working together to create a treatment plans, monitor progress, and respond to setbacks with therapeutic interventions rather than immediate punishment. Our concluding thoughts for Argument 1. Abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing creates a space for a more progressive and flexible response to crime and governance. This shift has the potential to move the criminal justice system further away from rigid punishment and toward alternatives that address the social and structural causes. Providing focused and effective rehabilitation to offenders represents an alternative form of governance that operates through welfare, offering citizens a safety net and support.
So, for the second argument, I'll be speaking about how laws requiring minimum sentences are expensive and ineffective because they don't increase public safety. What are mandatory minimum sentences? Laws known as mandatory minimum penalties or mandatory minimum sentences mandate that judges impose a minimum penalty when someone is found guilty of a particular crime. This implies that even if the judge feels that a lighter sentence would be more suitable given the facts of the case, they cannot impose a sentence that is less than that minimum. These laws, which can involve penalties like jail time, fines, or other legal restrictions, are primarily found in Canada's Criminal Code and Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. Mandatory minimum sentences are intended to maintain uniformity in punishment and to project a severe image. Proponents contend that they represent the public's demand for harsher punishments and aid in reducing sentencing inequalities. Critics counter that these rules may not truly lower crime, restrict judicial discretion, and result in biased outcomes. These worries have made mandatory minimum sentences a hot topic in criminal justice policy, particularly with regard to its efficacy, equity, and financial implications. Now we will be addressing why mandatory minimum sentences are expensive and ineffective.
The fact that mandatory minimum sentencing rules are expensive and frequently ineffectual in enhancing public safety is one of their main complaints. Although the goal of these laws is to deter crime and establish consistency in punishment, research indicates that their true effects are more nuanced. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws greatly lengthen jail terms for some offenses. According to research by Jeffrey Penny and colleagues, their study looks at the mandatory minimum punishments that were implemented in Canada in 2005 for a number of charges pertaining to child pornography and crimes against children. The researchers discovered, using data from national criminal courts, that the implementation of these regulations significantly raised average sentence durations, often by significantly more than the initial minimum term. The policy did not merely establish a baseline punishment, rather, it shifted the entire distribution of sentencing toward longer prison terms. For instance, the study discovered that sentence lengths for some offenses increased by 300% or more of the newly imposed minimum sentence. The financial ramifications of these lengthier sentences are substantial. According to Penny, the average annual cost of incarcerating a federal inmate in Canada is over $100,000. This means that even modest changes in sentence length can lead to significant increases in government spending on prisons and correctional institutions. There is little proof that mandatory minimum sentencing rules truly increase public safety or lower crime. Despite these increased expenses, instead of addressing the root causes of criminal behavior, the study indicates that these measures primarily alter sentencing results. Due to this, many academics contend that mandatory minimum sentencing laws raise significant concerns about its efficacy as a criminal justice policy, by increasing incarceration and public spending without clearly improving crime prevention. Neoliberal governance and mandatory minimum sentencing. It is helpful to examine the broader political and economic shift toward neoliberalism to understand why mandatory minimum sentencing laws have become so widespread. Neoliberalism refers to a system that emphasizes free markets, reduced social spending, privatization, and individual responsibility. However, it is important to clarify that neoliberalism does not simply reduce government power. Instead, it transforms how that power is exercised. While governments often withdraw from areas like welfare, housing, and social services, they simultaneously expand their role in punitive areas such as policing, surveillance, and incarceration. In other words, the state becomes less focused on supporting individuals and more focused on controlling and managing social issues through the criminal justice system. This shift helps explain the rise of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. These policies are based on the idea that harsher punishments and longer prison sentences will deter crime, but importantly, they reflect a broader neoliberal emphasis on individual responsibility. Crime is framed as a result of personal failure, rather than as something influenced by structural factors like poverty, inequality, or lack of opportunity. As a result, instead of addressing the root causes of crime, mandatory minimum sentences contribute to increased incarceration rates and higher public spending on prisons. They shift the focus away from prevention and social support and toward punishment and control. Overall, neoliberalism helps explain why these punitive policies persist, even when there is clear evidence that they are costly and often ineffective. A Marxist perspective on mandatory minimum sentencing. Another viewpoint that helps explain why mandatory minimum sentencing policies are expensive and ineffectual is provided by Marxist philosophy. Marxist theory holds that political structures and laws are not neutral, rather, they frequently represent the interests of powerful economic organizations. Marx maintained that the state and its legal system often function in ways that uphold social and economic inequality and safeguard established power structures. The criminal justice system can serve as a social control mechanism within this framework. Laws may be used to control and manage marginalized groups, especially those from lower socioeconomic classes, rather than to reduce crime. Marxist analysis highlights how conditions that lead to crime are created by disparities in wealth, opportunity, and resource access. However, punitive policies frequently target people with severe punishment rather than addressing these systemic reasons. This dynamic is reflected in mandatory minimum sentences. People from underprivileged origins who are more likely to interact with the criminal justice system may be disproportionately affected by these rules, which apply set penalties regardless of individual circumstances. Marxist theory holds that by criminalizing and imprisoning working class people instead of addressing more general socioeconomic problems like poverty, unemployment, or a lack of social support, this perpetuates already existing social injustices. Therefore, mandatory minimum sentences have the potential to increase incarceration without addressing the root causes of crime. Therefore, the claim that these policies are ineffectual in enhancing public safety is supported by Marxist theory. A Marxist strategy would prioritize resolving structural injustices and enhancing social circumstances as a more effective means to lower crime and improve community safety than allocating funds for harsh sentencing and prison construction. So, in conclusion, legislation requiring mandatory minimum sentences are frequently portrayed as a tough on crime approach, but the evidence indicates that they are both expensive and ineffectual. Mandatory minimum penalties restrict judicial discretion and flexibility in sentencing by requiring courts to apply a set minimum punishment regardless of specific circumstances. According to research, these measures may raise incarceration rates and financial expenses without enhancing public safety and are ineffective in deterring crime. The persistence of these regulations can be explained by the theoretical viewpoints that have been examined. From a neoliberal standpoint, crime policy typically places more emphasis on personal accountability and punitive measures than on solving more general social issues. According to Beaver, a Foucauldian viewpoint demonstrates how criminal justice institutions operate as surveillance and disciplinary systems that increase state power. According to Marxist theory, punitive measures that disproportionately impact excluded groups have the potential to perpetuate social and economic inequality. Research and theory together demonstrate that mandatory minimum sentences increase incarceration and expenses without enhancing public safety, indicating that more successful crime policy should concentrate on tackling the structural causes of crime, rather than depending solely on harsh punishment.
Moving on to the next argument of our presentation, I would like to argue that mandatory minimum sentencing laws should no longer exist in Canada on the basis that they undermine judicial discretion and result in unfair decisions in sentencing. They poorly reflect the overarching principles of the Canadian law and limit the democratic force of governance. The purpose of mandatory minimum sentencing is to automatically associate a fixed punishment with a certain crime. It does not matter the circumstance or any other varying factors that can be taken into consideration. The principles of mandatory minimum sentencing in theory promote equality and a baseline of consistent punishment. However, they fail to take into account the core legal principles of the law and that each circumstance and crime is different from another and should be treated as such. Throughout the course lectures, readings, and other material, there is a general theme of the conflict when the law must act. The debate largely surrounds whether or not the law should be based on morality or strictly in the event of to protect people's safety. Two of the key legal theorists in this course, being Hart and Devlin, debated this very concept on the fundamental values of the law. Hart's argument is that the law should only intervene to prevent harm, which suggests that the punishment must be applied carefully and proportionally. Mandatory minimum sentencing challenge these principles because they impose fixed penalties without allowing judges to assess whether or not the punishment is proportionate in a specific case. With that in mind, the argument that I'm going to look to make is that minimum sentencing is too boxed in and it takes away from judicial discretion, resulting in potential unfair sentencing. To start, I'm going to highlight what judicial discretion means as well as its importance. What judicial discretion is an opportunity for judges to give their own opinion on sentencing and take all the facts of the case into account. This can be a very good tool for judges as it allows them to use their professional judgment in terms of seriousness of the crime, the criminal history of the convict, as well as possible rehabilitation opportunities, and so much more. The complexity of criminals and their crimes should not be confined to such rigid procedures. By using mandatory minimum sentencing, it takes away the judge's ability to reflect on all extenuating circumstances to arrive at the right decision by just instituting an already chosen punishment. This ultimately results in so many cases being judged the same even though the circumstances of the case are vastly different. This can be seen as unjust and potentially the truly fair option not being taken into account due to a select number of factors. Connecting this point to a theoretical perspective study in class, I would like to connect this point to the works of Michel Foucault, as one of his core arguments in legal studies is that the law is controlled by state actors and dominant figures manipulating the course of power relations. Foucault's work focuses on how modern systems of punishment operate through institutional structures and disciplinary power. I think discourse is somewhat related to Foucault in the sense that discourse has the power to determine how future cases and policies are going to be handled, and shows how, in order to legitimize the law, there needs to be some sort of control one way or the other. Another problem that can be found in mandatory minimum sentencing is that they prolong the punishment of the crime far beyond the necessary or reasonable amount of penalty. Going back to the debate previously mentioned between Hart and Devlin, and their contradicting views on state actors' power and the way they address the issues of democracy. Specifically, Hart was the one who took the liberal approach in that the law should only be used to protect those from harm and not be used in a way to enforce moral behaviors. Hart's perspective outlines how criminal law should be used and why it is so important that it is conducted in a careful manner. The word careful is a key element as a law can have a serious impact on those convicted, so it's very important that it is applied appropriately with the careful considerations. Relating this theory-based concept back to our original point, mandatory minimum sentencing takes away the evaluation aspect of each specific individual circumstance. There is no assessment of the situation. It's just this is what the law says, so this is what's going to happen. The results of mandatory minimum sentencing have created tensions between levels of sentencing and as well as more severe crimes, as it isn't a cohesive bridge of what proportional punishment truly means and looks like. The next point I'm going to talk about is democratic principles of justice and the critiques of mandatory minimum sentencing through a democratic lens. Democratic political theory has its key aspects of fairness, equality, and involvement in society, and promotes protecting and preserving equality and justice for all. So, to add on to that, if a system does not consider each individual case to ensure equal and fair practices are being taken, it largely conflicts with the democratic principles of law. The main issue here is that if the courts are not able to address social context or systemic disadvantages, the decision could also result in propelling current social inequalities rather than looking to improve them. Looking at this point from a Marxist perspective, legal institutions are funded and shaped by social and economic structures. These types of institutions have the ability and the power to address the inequalities that we see in today's society, or they have the opportunity to feed into them. Based on this theoretical perspective, marginalized groups can be heavily influenced and impacted by the rigid sentencing policies. Some of the reasons why society would benefit from the removal of mandatory minimum sentencing are that it would create a much fairer justice system for all. Incorporating judicial discretion would give judges the opportunity to consider each and every aspect of each and every case and assess them accordingly. As mentioned in the second point, It would reinforce the level of care that needs to be applied, rather than an automatic decision based on previous cases that might not entirely be related. Third of all, it would bridge the gap between the judicial system and society's idea of democracy and its aligning perspectives. It's important to note that removing mandatory minimum sentencing allows for judges to decipher the difference between each case and propose punishments for what they believe to be a fair and lawful assessment of the case.
Throughout this presentation, we have shown that mandatory minimum sentences are not simply neutral legal tools. They are part of a broader way of governing punishment, shaping how crime is understood, and deciding how the state responds to people who come in contact with the justice system. While these laws are often defended as tough, consistent, and necessary for public safety, our presentation has shown that they are deeply flawed in both theory and practice. Our first argument was that abolishing mandatory minimum sentencing laws creates an opportunity for progressive reform. This matters because getting rid of these laws is not just about removing one sentencing policy. It is about rethinking what kind of justice system Canada wants to build. A progressive approach should not stop at criticizing harmful systems. It should also ask what better alternatives are possible and what more just forms of governance could look like. In that sense, abolishing mandatory minimums opens the door to a justice system that is more flexible, more proportional, and more responsive to people's actual circumstances, rather than one based on an automatic punishment alone. This point is especially important because punitive policies often become politically familiar and start to seem normal, even when they are ineffective or unjust. But just because a policy has become normalized does not mean it should remain in place. Reform requires the willingness to question systems that no longer serve justice well. From this perspective, abolishing mandatory minimums is not about weakening accountability. It is about creating the space for a more thoughtful, fair, and progressive approach to sentencing and governance. Our second argument was that laws requiring minimum sentences are expensive and ineffective because they do not increase public safety. One of the main justifications for mandatory minimums is deterrence, the idea that harsher punishments will stop crime and make communities safer. But the evidence presented in this presentation shows that this claim is weak. Research has repeatedly found that harsher sentences do not deter crime more effectively than fair and proportionate sentencing. At the same time, mandatory minimums contribute to longer incarceration, higher correctional costs, and greater public spending without clear evidence that they actually produce safety outcomes. This means that mandatory minimums fail not only as a matter of fairness, but also as a matter of public policy. They use significant resources while doing little to address the deeper causes of crime. If the goal is public safety, then it makes little sense to continue relying on a policy that increases punishment and costs without delivering the results it promises. A justice system should be evaluated not by how harsh it appears, but whether it actually works. Our third and last argument was that mandatory minimum sentences undermine judicial discretion and create unfair decisions. This point goes to the heart of sentencing itself. Judges are supposed to consider the facts of each case, the background of the accused, the seriousness of the offense, and the principle of proportionality. Mandatory minimums interfere with that process by forcing judges to impose fixed punishments, even in cases where those punishments may not be appropriate. As a result, these laws can produce outcomes that are unjust, disproportionate, and disconnected from the individual circumstances before the court. Punishment is not simply about responding to wrongdoing. It is also connected to institutions, regulation, and the exercise of power. From this perspective, legal institutions do not operate in a neutral or purely objective way. They shape behavior through discipline, standardization, and control, and they influence what kinds of responses are treated as normal or legitimate. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws reflect exactly this kind of institutional logic. They privilege fixed rules over human judgment and standardize control over individualized justice. Looking at the issue through this lens helps us see that mandatory minimums are not only problematic because they are harsh. They're also problematic because they represent a broader model of governance in which punishment is organized through rigid rules that limit flexibility and reinforce institutionalized power. In other words, they do not simply punish crime. They shape the justice system itself in ways that prioritize uniformity and control over fairness and proportionality. When we put these three arguments together, a clear conclusion emerges. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws should no longer exist in Canada because they keep the justice system tied to a rigid and outdated model. They block opportunities for progressive reform, they are costly and ineffective as tools of public safety, and they restrict judicial discretion in ways that can lead to unfair outcomes. More broadly, this debate is about what kind of justice system Canada wants to maintain. Do we want a system built on automatic punishment or one based on fairness, proportionality, and careful judgment? Do we want sentencing laws that simply look tough or laws that actually contribute to a justice in a meaningful way? Our group's position is that Canada should move away from a mandatory minimum sentencing and toward a model that allows for a more thoughtful and individualized decision making. A more just system is not one that punishes as rigidly as possible. It is one that responds proportionately, uses discretion wisely, and remains open to reform when existing policies no longer serve the public good. For all these reasons, we argue that mandatory minimum sentencing laws shall no longer exist in Canada.